Eric, you know it's underrated.
Us?
I mean, that's a given, and people are sleeping on us, and that's okay. I was going to say oligarchies. You can consolidate
Of
power
course.
amongst those with the expertise, and that neatly ties into us, the pyramids. I have, if you're on the YouTube, if you're not on the YouTube channel, that's okay. There's Spotify, there's iTunes, there's wherever else we're available. We're not quite sure. But we found who our enemies are, and now us dueling, wielding power at the same time. We're here to answer the biggest question in duality, if we are to rule things at the same time, and that is bulking and cutting. So it's a question that I think will stand the test of time, will survive past the new pyramids when they've been built. I'm pretty sure the ancient Egyptians, why do you think, Eric? So Egyptologists haven't confirmed this, but this is our, some would say, amateur hypothesis. But you know how they have a side image of most of the humans, the males? Those are actually let's call it early side chest poses, right? So they're kind of posing, and they were asking the pharaoh, the closest proximity to God in the afterlife, whether or not they should bulk or cut. So this one really, it's history, science, culture, us ruling up top, oligarchies, bulking and cutting. This is a monster episode.
Yeah, and for those who are watching on YouTube, you know, we see the factual ancient aliens who actually built the pyramids, and you can see that this is not a question that just goes back to ancient Egypt.
No,
this
sir.
goes back to I'm assuming, or you know, cultures that exist within our galaxy. Not that they traveled transgalactically to come to Earth over millions, if not billions of years ago, depending on their faster than light travel capabilities. But these aliens behind Omar are shredded. Now, two ways to look at this. One way to look at it is they must have just finished a fantastic cut, no pun intended there, and they are ready with that P ratio primed to get yakety yacked. Or another way to look at it is they really did not do a very effective cut, and they lost so much muscle mass. And you know what? In this episode, those aliens are going to find out the truth. Do they need to get that lean to potentiate their gains? Should they have not gotten that lean in the first place? Do they even lift? And why don't they have copyright law, you foolish, foolish aliens? So we're going to answer all those questions.
Oh, we're coming down. Our Delaware Corp is about to sue their ass, sue their intergalactic ass. I would say, Eric, this is the probably most interesting question. The aliens that we see behind us. And you know, if you just had a spitball, this is a classic internet question, Eric, so I'll ask you. And of course, they might have a different way of assessing body fat. But for those that are listening only by audio, so they can't see the aliens behind me, what do you think their body fat level is just before I go on? Because there is a point after that.
It doesn't look like they have body fat to me.
Okay, yeah.
They might have some visceral fat, but it's not visible.
So they've ascended past P ratios, and that's the interesting question, because I think when people ask the question about bulking or cutting, what they really want to know is, hey, what is the pathway, the shortest pathway towards ultimately getting to my desirable physique? And everyone has this goal. I mean, we've shared this before. There's so many fantastic episodes on Iron Cult where I said, and this is just how much you could be delusional when you first start out. I didn't know Arnold was a natural. I honestly didn't kind of want to look like Arnold. It was more Frank Zane, but I'm like, I want to build some. Hey, that guy's jacked. Let me get after that. You come up with the timeline. All right, an arbitrary one, 3 to 5 years. And so from wherever you're starting from, you want to organize in some manner your bulking and cutting phases so that you can optimally, if there's such a thing, if that really even exists, get to that goal in the least amount of time. So when people are asking that question, and I think there's always the real question underlying anyone's question when they ask someone, would be, how can I get to my goal the fastest? Is the best choice for me right now to try and bulk, aka build some muscle, or would it be to cut, to shred down a little bit? And unfortunately, as we're kind of talking about off air, Eric, depending upon what expert you ask and what slice of the fitness industry you fall in, or what era even, the answer can change, right? And it is entirely context dependent, but I think it is entirely understandable that the question still exists in different permutations, and some individuals are confused, and why it even is still such a thing in 2021 as it was in 3000 BC.
Yeah, I think you can find in the hieroglyphics the question that has eluded experts since the dawn of man, should I bulk or cut, bro? And I think that's the question. We're going to provide that context, like you said today. We're going to go through different arguments and rationale. If you have been one of the select few to keep your ear to the proverbial ground of the whisperings in the evidence-based community, if maybe you have listened to the not to be named other popular fitness podcast, or if you have been a subscriber to Mass,
That's a good one.
you might think, you know what they're going to be talking about today? P ratios. They already dropped a hint about those aliens. And we are going to touch on that, but honestly, that's only a small piece of this question. And we're going to discuss, really, like you said, Omar, is how do I think about, if you will, periodizing my weight gain and weight loss goals over time if my goal ostensibly is to put on a lot of muscle mass. And for a very long time, competitive bodybuilders have gone through cyclical phases. Now, part of that is just a facet of competition in that you have to get very, very lean. So that is a weight loss phase. Can't stay really, really lean and put on muscle very effectively. So then you're going to go through a weight gain phase. But there is an argument to, at least at some stage for some people, depending on your goal and where you start, to go through cyclical phases of cutting and bulking, if you will, even if you're a non-competitor. And even maybe if you're just in the off season, if you are a competitor. And we can talk about what those reasons are. So yeah, we're going to go through the science of P ratios, or rather the not so sciencey science of P ratios and the science opposed to it. We're going to talk about some of the misconceptions that are out there. And we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls that people go down when they take it too far. And then we're going to talk about, hey, what should you do? Because we're going to give you those keys that you can unlock your potential. Ooh. The keys to the pyramid, folks.
They can be yours. A little known fact is that actually the Rosetta Stone is the earliest form of a dumbbell. And most people, once again, Egyptologists, other individuals, when they take a look at it, they see the writing on it. Those are actually, once again, the numerical value of the weight being lifted by past people that use the Rosetta Stone. This goes back a long time. And I must say, as you eloquently put it, Eric, if you've been following along air to the ground, and even the concept is, P ratio, partitioning ratio, it's like, man, so now this would be 8 or 9 years ago when I first heard about that, when I first read about it. It was enticing, right? Because it's one of those things that maybe as a trainer, there's some things that you can't explain, that you don't quite understand, but you see when you're training your clients and you see there's a split, right? There's different individuals that will respond differently depending upon their caloric intake, whether they're in a mass phase or whether they're leaning down. And some people, once again, preferentially, it seems like they're retaining them. What's going on here? And so when you hear kind of a catch-all phrase that seems to describe some of the things that you're seeing, got them. It's like, this is now our newfound level of a new way of understanding things. But the problem becomes when you start then layering assumptions upon one initial assumption that doesn't ultimately hold true, that the whole house of cards can really fall down. And I think that is why that it's not just so we make, and it's not like we're mocking anyone, and it's not us personally, but it almost has become that meme of who asked the question, should I bulk or cut? It's the young kid that's not knowledgeable. But this is the perennial question. I think we can even extend, if we're getting to the outer limits of this discussion, we spoke, Eric, about for a bodybuilder, someone who wants to gain a considerable amount of mass. This is also a very relevant question for also competitive lifters, for weight class restricted lifters. And so, my man, the floor is yours. There's so many different ways we can start exploring it. I think maybe some definitions and then maybe the historical perspective a little bit before we go on. You do your thing.
Nice setup, my friend, as always. Much appreciated. And I like what you said. We should define our terms. Let's start with the terminology. So for those who maybe are not laying on the ground with their ear listening for rumblings about a P ratio, haven't subscribed to Mass, shame on you. Don't listen to the other so-called fitness podcast. Good job. Yep. I'm going to define some terms for you. So P ratio, what are we talking about? So this is actually goes back to something called Forbes theory. And if you have been aware of the academic research, this started in the 90s, and then Forbes revamped his theory in 2000, and then Kevin Hall wrote a paper called Forbes Theory Revisited in 2007. So I've actually been aware of this the whole time I've been lifting. This is something that people have talked about. And the original paper on Forbes theory itself is basically saying that individuals who are higher in body fat, when they gain or lose weight, are more apt to gain or lose fat. And individuals who are leaner, therefore lower in body fat, higher in lean mass as a proportion of their body, are more likely to gain lean mass when they're in a surplus and lose lean mass when they're in a deficit. And this was based on some mathematical modeling of a number of different participant groups that were all thrown into the same model. It's difficult when you read the papers, if you were to go check them out, they are in PubMed, to figure out where that data comes from, but you can. And Trexler recently reviewed a paper where he touched on this in Mass. And if you kind of do the footwork and you figure out where it all came from, and it's acknowledged in that Kevin Hall paper, you find that there is post-bariatric surgery patients who've lost a lot of weight and started with a very high body fat. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have weight regain in people who are recovering from anorexia. So we're talking like a BMI in some cases under 16. So these are people who are critically ill and have actually lost some essential lean body mass, like organ mass has atrophied and things like that. And so that makes a lot of sense. You know, when you have a huge amount of body fat and you start losing weight, yeah, you're going to predominantly lose body fat because that's such an available tissue. Adipose tissue is so easy to metabolize. And on the other end, when you actually have organ atrophy, and you are at a dangerously low level of body weight and lean body mass, the first priority from a survival perspective, once you are refeeding and recovering, is going to be to put that back on. So that model makes sense, but it's really important to remember that that is not a representative model of people who lift weights. And in fact, none of the population groups that were put into that model were weightlifters. None of them were doing resistance training. This was all sans exercise, these observations. So it was never meant to be applied to bodybuilders or lifters or athletes or even your general population of people who may have obesity and are trying to use exercise to reduce body fat. So I think that's a really important thing to state. Another thing is that this is a cross-sectional analysis. So what we mean by that is it's not looking at changes over time in both body fat initially and over time and the amount of weight gained, but more so it's looking at the trajectory compared to baseline body fat. So this is not necessarily related to where they started and where they got to, but perhaps could be something intrinsic to each individual. So if you just pick a random person on the street and you look at what happens in their trajectory of weight gain or weight loss, that's what I mean, rather than having someone actually diet to a certain point and then try to gain mass and see if that process affects it as though it was an intervention. Now, that's an important point because if you pick someone off the street who happens to be higher in body fat, that may be because of an intrinsic quality, not because of they didn't do the order right. You know, like they started their bulk too high in body fat. That might just be that they are someone who has more of a propensity to put on body fat, which might be why they're high in body fat in the first place. So that is something to consider. So those are all the kind of the limitations around P ratios. And, you know, Omar, to be honest, I've been asked about this numerous times in my career as someone who does his part to try to educate his fellow lifter. And I have not done as good of a job as Trexler has done in recent times, but I've always been very skeptical of this position and pointed out where it just doesn't seem to make sense, in that you see powerlifters and weightlifters generally having strength gains go up with weight class. It doesn't start to plateau at some point. It doesn't have a relationship that indicates it gets less and less efficient. Typically, the 120 plus class is stronger than the 120 class. It's not like they're a whole hell of a lot taller either. And we also see that, sumo wrestlers have the highest fat-free mass indexes in general. And those are things that I've pointed out. I've also pointed out that what we know from all of the data and experiences of natural bodybuilders post-competition, and some of the studies we have as well, is that they are primed to gain body fat. In one way, we've sort of debunked at least part of this by dealing with that quote-unquote post-contest anabolic rebound, which is, you do gain some glycogen. You can put on a lot of weight without putting on a whole bunch of body fat. And that's sometimes surprising. But then very quickly, the dream dies and you start to put on a lot of body fat. You're still hungry. Your energy expenditure is still quite low. And almost across the board, you see bodybuilders post-show gaining massive amounts of body fat. And sometimes it's crazy how quickly their physiques can change for the worse. And it can be depressing and devastating because you have such a strong drive to eat. So without going down that whole rabbit hole, and if anyone is curious about the terrible experiences post-comp, check out some of our other episodes. But if you would think about P ratio as a raw concept, being really, 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 really lean should give you the best P ratio. And you would think that once you got shredded for a show, if we took a strict interpretation of P ratios, it would actually be a challenge to ever gain body fat again.
Yeah.
So, so from that perspective, and this is before I go into some other data that kind of really puts the nail on the coffin proverbially, it's difficult to accept P ratios uncritically or without caveats. And and some of the qualifications are, well, okay, P ratios hold true if you don't go below your body fat settling point, right? And I think that that's a fair adjustment to the model. That's not someone shifting goalposts too extremely. If you get to the point where you're actually suppressing anabolic hormones, disturbing sleep, you're experiencing red S, relative energy deficiency in sport, the symptoms of chronic low energy availability, then yeah, that becomes a stronger signal. Fair call. Right. And I think that's why you see the recommendations generally, like quote unquote, like what you'll hear, and I do believe these are numbers just completely pulled out of thin air, is that for a male, you want to diet down to, 8 to 10% body fat. And then you want to bulk up to, around 12 to 15% body fat. To spoil the plot for most people, most people aren't even 12 to 15% body fat walking around who lift.
Yeah.
But it is a better suggestion than a pure interpretation of P ratios, which is you need to diet down to 5% body fat as a male, and then you'll be good forever because you will not be able to put on fat mass.
The point, Eric, the point of no return, man. I was just going to say quickly, you being a bodybuilder would give you a wholly unique perspective being a natural bodybuilder where it doesn't hold up to a certain, you would clearly see, as you said before, that wait a second, after my contest phase, now theoretically I'd be at my most anabolic, which I've never observed to be the case amongst myself, my competitors. I know all these competitors. It's almost like how relativity breaks down at the singularity of a black hole. Where it's like, oh, okay, so you're saying that this should happen, but actually the exact opposite is happening. So giving you that interesting insight whenever you would hear it. Whereas I would say for some of us thick boys, earlier on, we want to believe in Eden. Eric, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, oh, there is that promised land, at a certain body fat percentage. Oh, I just got to get down to be a leaner body fat percentage. And sure, I might have a natural propensity when I gain weight to have a little bit more of it be fat. But if I lean down, right, it's one of those lucrative truths. It sounds like if I lean down to a certain threshold, I too will be able then to mass, and the ratio will be more favorable towards muscle. So like thick boys want to look on it thinking, oh, this sounds really good. And you're just meanwhile experiencing this thinking, I'm, 5% body fat. I feel terrible. There's absolutely no way here that I could build the most amount of muscle mass ever.
Yeah, my gains are not going to be potentiated right now. I can't even get it up, nor can I sleep through the night. I just have a feeling this is not great for building crazy amounts of muscle mass.
Yep.
So 100%. But I think it's very fair to go, okay, hold on. No, this only applies within what is a quote unquote like sustainable or quote unquote normal body fat percentage for any given individual. And to that, you mentioned how the experience of being a competitive bodybuilder kind of take the strict interpretation of P ratios off the table. I would say the experiences of being a powerlifting coach have also questioned it even within those modifications. Because like you said, it does certainly confirm not the biases, the hopes and dreams of some of the thick boys. But what I have observed and what many people will tell you, and I do think it can be taken too far and it doesn't apply to all people, but sometimes you can gain a level of strength or break a plateau or get to quote unquote the next level in strength by pushing your body fat higher to certainly at least what Instagram would suggest is acceptable, which is, a really low bar. It's like, you'd be proud of your eating disorders. But a great example would be that, Bryce Lewis went from being a highly competitive elite lifter in the top 5 in the USAPL 93 kilo class to being a multi-time national champion in the 105s, being a world record holder at times, and currently being among the top 2 in the world in the 105 class, him and Ashton Rushka. I'm really excited to see, those future battles. He's totaling, both of them are totaling over 900 kilos. And not like just by a little bit, Ashton, I think, totaled 950. If I'm remembering correctly in his meet, and Bryce in his mock meet just did 937. So that's literally, for gaining 12 kilos of body weight, his total has gone up over 100 kilos.
Yep.
And of course, there's multiple years of training, but I having had the pleasure to work with him, there was stagnation and very much felt like we were in a slow plateau, and that did change when we went up in body weight. And he's not the only one to observe that. That's been something that a lot of people have noticed, that sometimes even if you're eating sufficiently, you're not in a deficit, you're eating at maintenance and occasionally in a surplus, and you just cut down to make weight for your meets, and then you let your body weight get a couple kilos over your weight class limit, there does seem to be, you just are not your strongest in X weight class. You need to be in X plus 1. And that is where you unlock this whole new level of gains. And you are higher in body fat. Yeah. So I think that's something that's been observed enough times for me to have always been pretty skeptical of it. And what I think Eric did, and shout out to Greg as well, was that he looked at it with even more evidence. He actually said, what a good model for this is American football. So we can look at linemen and skill, quote unquote, position players, which is everyone except linemen. And they have the same S&C coach. They have probably very similar off-season, at least weight training programs. And they are trying to put on muscle mass. And we see very consistently that linemen, if anything, actually have a better P ratio. Their body fat tends to go down while they're gaining muscle mass, or at least staying roughly the same. And they're gaining similar or more amounts of muscle mass than the skill position players. And this is shown in 4 or 5 studies. And the most interesting thing is that there have been studies on linemen, and that despite the fact that they're playing football, practicing, doing aerobic training, anaerobic training, lifting weights, and they're young, they often are insulin resistant. So that's one thing I haven't discussed, is that the proposed mechanism, at least the most common one I hear, for advocating getting lean first before you bulk, is because insulin resistance will make it harder for you to shuttle nutrients into muscle, so that you're going to get poor gains, right? Now, in the face of knowing that something like half, in one study that I saw, of the linemen were insulin resistant, and almost all of them are like over 25% body fat, the fact that insulin resistance and high level of body fat didn't hamper their ability to make arguably better gains than the skill position players, I think that draws into question P ratios as well. Now, the counter argument to that, now this I would actually consider a little bit of a goalpost shift, but it still could be true. Unlike the other one that I thought was understandable of, okay, this only applies within sustainable body fat levels, is, well, linemen are also, naturally selected to be in that position. They have a greater propensity for putting on muscle mass. Now, I'm happy to accept that as true, maybe. But if we do, that means we therefore also have to accept that the influence of P ratio is easily overshadowed by other factors, such as genetics or things like that. So now we have to be at the point where, okay, it only matters if you are within normal body fat percentage range. If you get too lean, it doesn't count. And while it does have an influence, it is overshadowed by things like a greater genetic propensity to build muscle, even in the face of measured insulin resistance, which is the proposed primary mechanism of P ratios being the way they work. So I think that really draws it into question, or at least draws into question the relevance, even if it does have an influence. But Omar, that wasn't even the final nail in the coffin.
You're about to slay Dracula himself, because one thing I just want to note what you said, Eric, is funny, the cognitive dissonance of some coaches, where they could say at the same time, you're let's say 25, 30% body fat. Bro, you're at the perfect place now to lose fat and build muscle. You're going to be so anabolic. And then also, under the same breath, wait a second, the most ideal place to build muscle is when you're lean as hell. It's like, so wait, which one is it? Are you most anabolic when you're this thick boy that has all this extra energy in the form of fat? Or are you the most anabolic when you're 8% body fat?
Omar, I love that you brought that up, and this goes back to our episode with Chris Barakat, where we talked about body recomposition, and we, like the standard thing that is said in the evidence-based community is body recomposition. It can only happen in novices and people who are very high in body fat, people returning to a layoff, people using drugs. And he came on and said, well, it's actually a little more common than that, even in trained individuals. And people will accept that to the degree that they accept that. But I've heard literally no one dispute that being high in body fat helps you and puts you in a great position to recomp, just like you said. And I've literally heard the same people promote the idea of P ratio. So you have to get lean first to make lean gains, while also promoting the idea of recomping. And those are diametrically opposed positions. You literally, if you think about it, can't believe both to be true.
Right.
Because in reality, if you were really high in body fat and it means that your P ratio is bad, that means you should be worse at recomping. That if you were to try to put on muscle mass, it wouldn't happen. You would just gain body fat. And then the goalpost shift there could be, well, no. You have to be in a deficit. And then you can lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. And then the proposition is that somehow being in a calorie deficit is better for building muscle when you're high in body fat and improves your P ratio than actually being in a surplus. And at that point, you just have to ask, am I holding on to something that is perhaps just not true?
Past its
and
expiration
twisting
date.
the logic. Yeah, like I'm twisting this logic into ways that start to contradict fundamental truths of exercise science and nutrition. But like I said, Omar, that wasn't the final nail in the coffin, and all credit goes to Greg Nuckols and Eric Trexler. So what they did was they went out searching for all the open access data they could find, where they reported individual data in studies where people did resistance training, and they had their initial body fat, and they looked at the trajectory of their lean gains. And they entered this into a regression model. There's unfortunately not a whole lot of open access individual data with all, measured body fat and changes in both lean mass and fat mass. But they also have enough connections with people. So I was able to give them the data from my PhD. Dr. Zerdos was able to give the data from some of his work that he's done out in Florida Atlantic. And I think they found maybe 5, 6 or 7, but a good handful of studies. So they have hundreds of subjects now across the range of body fat, all the way from being lean to being very high. And they're in a regression model. And if anything, I would say the conservative analysis of it is that there's no impact of body fat on the lean gains that you make. But the multiple regression model, I think that the final one they came up with actually had the opposite finding, that the P ratio improves when you're higher in body fat, that there was I would say a moderate correlation, if I recall correctly. And I'm sure that Greg and Eric will post this as an article in the future. So don't take this as the definitive word. This is just from talking to them. I haven't actually seen the full data set. I believe that the regression model actually shows greater lean gains the higher you are in body fat. So best case scenario for those who are really trying to hold on to the P ratio thing is that it doesn't matter. But it is possible that you actually have better propensity to put on lean mass when you're higher in body fat. So I think at this stage, we pretty much just have to accept that from the mechanistic perspective of does being lean potentiate hypertrophy and does it reduce the amount of adipose tissue you gain when you go into a gaining phase, we have to say pretty confidently the answer is no. However, Omar, my advice still is that you probably don't want to start a bulk too high in body fat in many scenarios. And there are actually a number of reasons for that. So this is one of those cases where we don't necessarily need to use the same logic we had before. And in some cases, that can actually lead you down pretty harmful practices that end up in you spinning your wheels in best case scenario, worst case scenario, maybe developing a negative relationship with food or your body. Which we can talk about, but I generally do have similar recommendations. I think, when we did in our first, lovely, fateful time spent together in Toronto, which began us on this lovely trajectory where we find ourselves today, we created a Kaizen program called Nutrition for Lifters. And in it, I advised males, as an example, that probably don't want to start a bulk when they're, over 20% body fat. And same thing for women, just add about 8% to that. And the reason was because, from a very practical perspective, most people who are trying to put on muscle mass are doing so because they want to have a certain aesthetic, all right? They may be, let's say they're not competitive bodybuilders. They are, recreational lifters, recreational bodybuilders interested in molding their physiques and empowering themselves to look a certain way and going, I want to look powerful, I want to look muscular, and I'm here to support you to look the way you want, which of course better be yakety yak or I have no respect for you. No, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, I think most people want to look a certain way. And I can tell you from experience, both as a coach, as an athlete, and Omar, I'm sure you can speak to this as well, that even when you are making good gains, when you're relatively high in body fat, you just look worse when you're putting it on because you don't have the separation. Maybe you look a little bit better in a shirt. This is something, I think Jeff Nippard talked about, like with bear mode, and like there is a range you can still make it work, but at a certain point, it just doesn't look better. And this is an observation I first noticed actually on the way down dieting bodybuilders for show, that there's what we call the tweener phase or the dead zone, where you're starting in like the high teens, and your goal is, of course, like we said, for a male to get down to like 5% or a woman down to like 10%. When you're a male going from, say, like 18% body fat to, say, like 14% body fat, or a female going from the high 20s to like the mid 20s, you look smaller because you're now in a deficit. You have, muscle glycogen getting depleted, but you still don't have separation because the body fat levels are too high. So you just look like you're losing muscle and you're dieting. So you spend maybe the first month or two just not liking what you see in the mirror and feeling like there's no reward. And that is a point where a lot of athletes start to feel like the diet isn't going well. But in reality, it is just that you can't see the fruits of your labors. And if you think about it mathematically, let's say you have 40 pounds of fat to lose and you lose 2 pounds of fat, that's 5% of your fat. When you have 10 pounds of fat left to lose and you lose 2 pounds, that's 20% of your fat on your body. So it's a 4 times greater relative loss of body fat, and it's so much more visible. When you're losing, at a faster rate, 1 to 2 pounds a week, when you're, 8 weeks out from a competition, you don't see much going on. But even when you're losing like at half that rate, 0.5 to say 1 pound per week, when you only have 5 to 8 pounds left to go to get on stage, every week you can see visible changes. So it is one of those things where I think the anecdotes that support the idea of P ratios might just come down to the fact that you're making great gains or okay gains or similar gains, but you can't tell just because it's not looking good. So I don't know if that's an anecdote that you would support or that you've seen similarly.
Eric, 100%. I think bringing in the psychological component, or overall, let's call it motivation in the gym to actually pursue your desired goal, and that being related to how you look in said gym, is very important. It can't be understated, because I think sometimes some models, where we joke about this, some of the models would basically exclude the human component. Well, if you do exactly this, if you follow this dietary plan, if you eat this amount of calories, you will get shredded in the fastest amount of time. It's like, yeah, but there's actually a higher likelihood that you actually might fail this, that you might go off the program, that it might not be sustainable, all these factors. So we talk, and I think one of the undercurrent themes of Iron Culture is, how can we set up any goal so that you have the most likely outcome to actually achieve it? And so tying that then to how someone looks and then their motivation can't be understated, where you brought up our boy Jeff Nippard, because I'm lifting with him, chatting with him a lot. There's someone, and I won't name his name, a former training partner of his, who actually was almost in a Bryce Lewis scenario, just to give a small anecdote, but how it's very real amongst, let's call it, more advanced lifters. So people that are lifting for quite a long period of time, have built appreciable amount of muscle, and also have gotten strong, where he essentially could have gone almost a Bryce Lewis mode, where his body fat level would have gone up and he would have gotten proportionally even stronger, because it just seemed to be the way that things were trending. But his motivation, because he's kind of one of those classic 3DMJ boys, where it's like they love to lift big, but they also want to look good, and they do like leaning down. He's most motivated in the gym. He's most excited to enter the gym when he's a certain level of leanness. Let's say when abs are at least semi-visible. So his motivation in the gym, he tries to tie it to powerlifting, tries to tie it to the strength numbers when he's bulking, but his mojo isn't there when he's in the gym. And so he actually applies himself both in and outside of the gym more when he's leaner. So in his opinion, he likes to remain leaner year round because he finds that his adherence overall is better. His dietary adherence, so he actually finds all those things become congruent. So the amount of sleep he gets, where he starts thinking, "Hey, I should go to sleep right now." Whereas when you're bulking, it's like I feel fat, I feel lazy. Oh, I got to do this. Like all these factors start creeping in. And so I think it's a very interesting question, Eric, when we talk about what the general constraints of what someone should try and be, when they're leaning down or when they're bulking, how far is too far. And a lot of that, the underrated component is that psychological profile, the profile of the individual. How likely are they to adhere? And this is probably, for you being a coach, I can only imagine, have had so many tough conversations where maybe someone thinks they could do something, and not that as a coach, I've seen, there's a 90% chance. For me, dealing with clients, there's about a 90% chance that it's going to happen. But you have to have some hard conversations, and I think the psychological component for bulking and cutting, that's a big can of worms to open up.
Oh man, and we're gonna get some worms out, because I love that you brought that up. It's appropriate that you've got the pyramids behind you.
Thank you.
Because the pyramids were written, they were written after the videos, but I made the pyramid videos on YouTube because of my experiences doing, I would say on average, 4 Skype consultations a week with like one-off clients. So people who may or may not have continued consulting with me over time, but they came to me with their story, their application, this data, their goal, and we had, an hour-long chat, helped them develop a program and a game plan. And I can't tell you how many times I had the same conversation with people, and I don't mean this to be like, these fools, but just almost it was hard to hear, because I could see that they were struggling, in that they had tried maybe 5 or 6 times. I'd say on average 3 to 4 times, if I think about it. And this is maybe a third of the people I talked to, and that's a lot, who had tried multiple times to get lean to then have a bulk. And invariably what happened is they got that lean, and then the bulk turned into a binge, more or less an extended binge. And they were just simply unable to sustain the body fat percentage they wanted. And, this has multiple elements. I'm not going to lay the blame on the promotion of P ratios or the idea that you have to get lean before you bulk. I think most of it just lays on the fact that there are, pressures to look a certain way. And this extends to both men and women. And I think it's only been exacerbated in the social media age.
Yeah.
So I think these most of the time, these were people who were not driven by, I need to get lean to bulk, but rather I want to get lean. And I've heard that if I get lean, I can make leaner gains, because I want to keep looking like this, but I want to look more muscular. And then the psychological factors, the pressures that they get from being so restrained and restricted, and then the biological drive to eat was something that they simply could not do in the way they intended. And I think also they probably weren't getting, the benefits they expected. They weren't making leaner gains, because as we established, that's not a thing. And if they got too lean, it actually might have even hampered their ability to gain muscle. But more importantly is that those psychological factors. They got there, and it was just, they had to white knuckle it the whole way. And as soon as now their goal is to gain weight, it easily became, eating in a way that really did not help them maintain that leanness. So the hard conversations I had a lot of the time were, I think we need to be honest about what is a realistic body fat percentage to maintain. And then also, do we need to keep repeating this process? What beliefs do you have, like around P ratio, that are, I wouldn't say the cause of this cycle, but perpetuating it, feeding into it? And I think that is my real beef with the P ratio, is that I have seen it get incorporated into this damaging cycle enough times that it bothers me, and that I wish people would think a little more about the advice to, cut to 10% as a male and then bulk to 15%, when that's applied to some people who aren't even walking around at 15% body fat. That's asking them to always maintain a body fat that has historically not been possible for them, right? So that means the limit of their bulk is leaner than they are currently.
Yeah. And
I can't tell you how many times I've seen that result in people spinning their wheels. So yeah, I think that needs to be said about this, about the psychological side of things. And the practical solution that I've always said is, you'll know it's too lean because you're food focused. You live meal to meal. That becomes too important, Now there's more that goes into it, But in someone who does not have a prior issue with their relationship with food, who has quote unquote a normal relationship with food, I know that's hard to say in 2021. If you just happen to walk around as a male in the 16 to 20% body fat range, which by the way, just because the internet says 15% is like average, there's literally zero unhealthy about 16 to 20% body fat. That's not considered too high. There's no like empirical data that would suggest some cutoff of 15% is negative for males. And again, you could say the same thing about adding 10% to that range for women. So anyway, like there is, from a health perspective, that's an arbitrary line in the sand. And from a psychological perspective, for people who don't have a prior eating disorder, if that's just simply below where they're currently at, they will know it because when they get down to less than that and they hang around there, they're going to have some level of food focus. And I think that's really what dictates bodybuilders is where they get back to. Now, some part of that is also how long they spent in the deficit, how restrictive the diet was, etc. But if you could just wave a magic wand and not have someone diet and then just appear at a given body fat percentage, it would change some of those hormonal regulators signals and their subsequent levels of hunger and satiety before and post meals, and they would find their body fat starting to trend upwards. And there is probably like a settling point range, and it can be modified by behavior and environment and activity and all the stuff we've talked about previously in Iron Culture. But there probably are some lower limits that no matter what you do will result in some level of food focus, discomfort, physiological downregulation that's not conducive to your goals. And I think it's important to pay attention to that and to respect that and just accept that your range may not be the range that the internet says. But like we said, ostensibly, your goal is to look good, right? You want to look like a bodybuilder, or at least, a beach lean off-season bodybuilder. So it's very understandable that some people would not want to be like, oh, great. I mean, I can put on a ton of muscle regardless of my body fat. Okay, I'm going to be up to 30, 40% because why not, right? I can have my cake and eat it too, quite literally. And I don't think people would accept that. Killing P ratios as a concept and at least used to get lean before you bulk doesn't change that reality of what people's desires are. This is a moderator, not a causative factor. So indeed, I do think there is probably a point to not starting a bulk when you're very high in body fat. But I think the lowest you want to get, so if you're going to cut before you bulk, which is totally fine, you want to cut to something that is sustainable. Period. That's the simple answer, right? It's not about necessarily potentiating gains. It is purely, well, maybe not purely. I will talk about health in a moment. It is pretty much in normal body fat percentage ranges, just about setting yourself up so that you feel like the bulk was successful, that you enjoy it, that you can stick with it. Because as we've talked about, once you're a late stage intermediate and advanced lifter, you're going to have slow muscle gains. You're not going to be trying to gain a lot of weight per week. And even if you are, best case scenario, you're looking at a very small percentage of that weight gain being lean mass. So if you gain at a fast rate, or if you start already high in body fat, very quickly, you're not going to like what you look like. But you will need to spend a lot of time in a surplus to give that environment that is permissive to growth. So if you want to spend multiple months gaining weight, if you start high in body fat, you're very quickly going to get demotivated. And if you need to be multiple months in a surplus, that means you need to kind of have some top end, which is not too high in body fat so that you are able to assess progress and enjoy the process. So the general recommendation I make is, once you get to like the 20% body fat range or cutoff, unless you are fine with it, unless you don't care, unless like you just purely care about strength and muscle mass despite fat gain doesn't bother you, go for it, all in, have fun, with one caveat, which we'll talk about in a second. But as a general rule, most people who are men start to not feel like they can see the fruits of their labors around there. But it's not because I think 20% is magic. It's because that is what I associate with when most people tell me I don't like what I see in the mirror. But really it comes down to, what do you like to see in the mirror? And if you're good with it and you think you can put on some body fat from there, then feel free to start your bulk.
So I heard 20% body fat is the limit, absolute limit. Got it. Going to go forth. Going to conquer. We got it. When people want the neat little answers, like, okay, and I think that's the lucrative aspect of things like a P ratio to confirm a particular bias that someone wants to hear. Where I think there is the social pressure, like Eric, we talk about the biopsychosocial model of pain. I think you can actually easily apply that when it comes to body composition, We spoke about the psychological pressure, the social then pressure of your peers, where you add another factor on top of this in the form of social media, where it's kind of corrosive. It's all encompassing, where no matter what, basically there will always be, and it's not just the negativity bias, there is a larger proportion because it's almost like groupthink, where there's that pressure to conform. So whatever your percentage is, it's never good enough because I think everyone wants this ideal that might not be sustainable. We talk about, Danny Lennon spoke about that triangle, about composition, performance, health. But then there's that triangle where everybody wants to be their strongest at the same time as they are their leanest, at the same time they are their most muscular, right? And those three things might not happen at the exact same time in an absolute sense. So there's immense pressure. And also, it's almost like there is someone passing off their own, I wouldn't say inadequacies, but they want to be a certain way. And so if someone else, I've seen this so many times amongst young kids. And that's why I would say the questions I get, not my perspective, but my experience would be slightly skewed compared to you with the competitive bodybuilders, where for a lot of the kids, they're in this middle ground of no man's land where they haven't been training for a long period of time. They're dissatisfied with the way they look. They haven't built up the appreciable amount of muscle mass they would need to really, if they lean down, you know what I mean, Eric, they would look the way they want to look, so how they envision. So they've been kind of starving themselves. They're developing maybe slowly an unhealthy relationship because they feel all this pressure. So the pressure they put on themselves, the pressure they hear from their peers, when they see, once again, on social media. So it might not even be direct social pressure. It might be indirect, where they see other people succeeding, and that makes them feel worse because, wait a second, I'm doing the same things they're doing, but I'm not looking like how they're looking. What's going on, you know? So for my little slice, oftentimes what I would advise someone when they're in that range, so they're definitely within 10 to 20% body fat, more like 14%, 15, 16%, but they haven't built that appreciable amount of muscle. And I know this, if they lean down, they're not going to be satisfied with the way they look because really they're after a look that they just haven't put in enough time for. That's, I think, a large shift. What I've noticed on a massive scale probably has been towards strength movements, where it's kind of a way for individuals to put their time and attention into something. They'll get a high yield while they're not aesthetics focused. And I don't mean that they're absolutely not aesthetics focused, but at least they can see the fruits of their labor. Like, hey, I'm gaining weight, but I'm also getting stronger. So this is awesome. They're tying it to something. And if many strength athletes are truthful, and I don't know, maybe in the comment section, some people can say this, but it's been my experience from interacting with numerous strength athletes that some of them, and there's even that person, it was popular for a time, the saying, this powerlifter, where he joked, I tried to become a bodybuilder, but I couldn't get aesthetic enough. So I gave that up and decided to become a powerlifter. Like, he was joking, right? Like, obviously it's just a joke, but it's like an industry joke where if you hear a lot of the people that then somehow find their way into strength sports, a decent portion of them are individuals that once again decided to focus on something else so that they could still be motivated if they weren't quite satisfied with how they looked at that particular period in time. So I think when we talk about bulking and cutting, it's not just the simple binary question of like, okay, like, what are your stats here? What are your stats? It's like, what does this person really want? And how can we really get them to their goal? So almost in a way, I see the potential harm of something like a P ratio, where it could be a needless constraint on someone who's already struggling enough as it is.
Yeah, and it makes you continually refocus on something that you don't have a whole lot of agency to make a huge impact on, or at least see it. You know, like, I try not to focus too much on my aesthetics, even though I'm a competitive bodybuilder, until I'm within a certain proximity of the show. I don't mean months. I mean, like, you know, like, for example, 2022, I'm probably going to do primarily an off-season bodybuilding, you know, focus. And I'll be trying to look at myself and go, like, you know, last time I was, you know, 40 pounds over stage weight, 30 pounds over stage weight, 20 pounds over stage weight. I don't think I'll be 40 over, but across all those different body weights over stage weight, do I look better now? How does my physique look? But right now, 2021, I'm pretty much just focused on my numbers, because it's a disempowering experience for me at this stage of my career, at this body fat level, to just be focused on, like, hey, do my delts look better today? Do my delts look better today? Do my delts look better today? You know, and that only gets exacerbated if you're told, okay, now you need to cut like every couple months, you know, or every 3 or 4 months, down for like 1 or 2 months. So I think that continual refocusing on something that is just going to take a while to change at a certain stage in your career often isn't mentally healthy. So I would agree with you. Now, there is one other reason that I would advise having some kind of reasonable cap on someone's body fat before they start to bulk. Let's go back to the American football data. I did acknowledge that linemen who, the majority of them are over 25% body fat, and roughly half in the study I'm thinking of did have insulin resistance. That's not good. Even if it doesn't necessarily interfere with your gains, being insulin resistant isn't great for metabolic health. That is that could predispose you to getting, diabetes or various other health complications. And you were talking about, the kind of that Venn diagram of performance, body composition, and health. And I think almost every lifter who can fall into one of like three categories. There's people who are lifting for health, right? That's their primary goal. And they get side benefits to performance or body composition. They're like, I'm not mad my biceps got bigger, but I am primarily doing this so I can be, stronger, have longevity. And you'll see these goals shift. I think when you talk to people who are older and they start to see if their strength might go away if they stop lifting, or they don't have as much function, that starts to become more of a primary factor. Or if someone's been injured, that becomes more of a primary factor. So some people do lift for health, and the other aspects are secondary. Some people lift for gains, and that's probably the vast majority of people who listen to this podcast. And there's two categories after that. Some people are willing, that their primary goal is making gains, but they don't want to compromise their health. And other people are willing to make gains, and they're happy to compromise their health.
Yeah.
And the only degree to which they don't want to compromise their health is to the point where it'll stop them from being able to make gains, right? So I don't want to die, get injured, or, like not be able to lift when I'm like 30 or something like that, or 40. Excuse me. So anyway, I think in all cases, though, there is some point where people care about health. So I can't answer this question for you. And of course, I'm not saying that insulin resistance is like a death sentence, or that it's not counterbalanced by the fact that you're active, eating healthy, doing a lot of other things that hopefully you're doing. But it is worth considering that if you get too high in body fat, that can have knock-on effects in health. And again, pointing out that linemen are athletes. They're lifting weights. They are doing all this stuff, and they're still experiencing that. So while I'm not at all denying that you can take someone who is high in body fat and make them healthier while being weight neutral and not dropping body fat, we also can't deny that there are certain points when body fat gets high, despite doing all those things, that it can have a negative impact on health. It's not the only signal impacting health. It doesn't mean that your overall health is bad, but I think that is something to pay attention to. So if you are someone who is totally fine with aesthetically being high in body fat, let's say you're a super heavyweight and you're like, oh, okay. Or let's say you're a weight class below super and you want to go up to super. Let's say you're a strength athlete. You need to decide, okay, well, to what degree am I wanting my health to be negatively affected? What's a line in the sand here? And I would advise getting blood work done, talking to your GP, and actually seeing what your health values are. Because just because half the linemen in that study did have insulin resistance doesn't mean they all did. And it doesn't mean that it was really bad or had other effects. So I think if you decide to be someone who is comfortable with a very high level of body fat, just monitor your health. That's the only thing I'm suggesting. And just be aware that is one of the many factors that goes into it. And that's another rationale for possibly, deciding to have a cap there. So in general, the answer of should I bulk or cut is answered quite simply. If you haven't developed much muscle mass yet and you're not very, very high in body fat, I would say, yeah, start bulking. If you are very, very high in body fat, we know from that body recomp episode and what we've talked about here that you can put yourself into a slight deficit. You can go through a fat loss journey and you can make substantial gains anyway. You're going to be recomping quite effectively, putting on muscle. You're still going to get those newbie gains so long as your training is effective and you're not doing anything crazy in your journey to lose body fat. But I really do mean people who are very high in body fat. I don't mean the folks, Omar was talking about who are relatively normal, even high normal, and are just being negatively influenced by social media. So yeah, I think those are your answers. And a lot of it's going to come down to your individual goals, how much you value health, to what degree your health is affected, what your natural settling point is, and what you're comfortable with and what your goals are. And then also assessing, well, is what I'm comfortable with really what I'm comfortable with, or is it heavily influenced by unrealistic expectations, social media, and what I'm consuming? do I constantly feel like I don't look good or look muscular unless I achieve X percentage body fat? And if that is the case, my friend, I think unfollow a lot of people. I think start to focus more on performance. I think start to view things differently. I think try to get to the point where you can acknowledge your self-worth without it being attached to a body fat percentage. You want to come from a perspective of I'm lifting because I deserve it, I'm worthy, I can accomplish these goals. It's more about achieving something rather than just trying to remove something about yourself that you don't like. I know that's a hard thing to get to, and it does take a lot of work, but I think it is one of the most important things to be operating from a place of self-respect, self-worth, and excitement about what you can achieve rather than a place of self-loathing, not wanting it, and needing to change things about yourself that you really can't stand.
Self-respect when it comes to lifting. Ew, Eric, we're doing this because we hate ourselves. Come on, let's be honest here. I do think there are a lot of interesting points to add on to what you just said, which, you answered the question for people. They now have the answer. This is what you wanted. But we're going to throw a wrench in the system by talking almost about the third option, which is maintaining and actually how that in and of itself can be progress. Because I think I am thinking of the example now, Eric, of Lee Priest, right? Where he would go through those big dirty bulk phases before he would lean down. Well, I think for some people, they need that superficial, large level of change, of fluctuation in their body weight to feel like they're making progress. So that is one of the appeals of the dirty bulk or bulking in addition to, removing any restraints, feeling like you could eat anything. But it's like, wow, I gained 30 pounds. And when I lean down, like when I get back down to the same body fat level, I must have added at least 5 pounds of muscle mass. And you know this, being an actual bodybuilder who competes, and this is the hard truth. No, it's like you could gain 30 pounds. Like you could go on the forever bulk. Like this, like Eric right now, if he was like, you know what, I'm just gaining 30, 40 pounds. I'm going to go up. I'm going to be a 120. Forget being a 93 or 105. I'm going up to 120 for the next, 12, 14 months, just gain 50, 60 pounds, 20, 30 kilos of body weight. It's like when you lean down, it's like, do you really think even 5 kilos you would have added to your frame? No, right? And I do think for some people, they need those large numbers. And when I posted, so obviously COVID's going on in 2020, and my goal, because for a long period of time, I do think I fall in that category of Bryce Lewis, that when my body fat level is, let's say, a little higher than what would be deemed social media aesthetic, I perform better, proportionally better on my lift. So, Omer at a 70% body fat is a deadlier strength athlete than Omer at 9% or 10%, even if you judge by Wilks or whatnot. Cool. And so I lean down.
70% body fat. I love it.
70% body fat is look, they call me the whale for a reason, and not just because I make a big splash in things. You know what I'm saying?
You just get all your eating done in 1 month of the year, and then you just live off your body fat for the other 11. I love it.
Hibernate, bro. Major hibernation. So with that being said, Eric helped me when I was leaning down. I leaned down, so I went from a high, because that high, I gained that weight. I wanted to get stronger. I actually had the goal in my head of benching 405. Things didn't happen, cool, whatever, so I leaned down. But I was leaner than would be ideal for strength, but COVID happened and all these other things. And it's been a phenomenal opportunity to maintain a relatively leaner frame while then slowly and appreciably getting stronger once again. And when I made that post, and I made like a year-to-year comparison where basically I was the same weight, and there was not a small amount, it actually was a significant amount in the comment section. It's like, I don't understand. Like, why would you? It's a whole year of training and you're just the exact same body weight. This is a failure. Like, you didn't do anything. Like the number hasn't budged either which way. Like, if I was dirty bulked in their eyes, if I dirty bulked 15 pounds, 20, 25 pounds, at least you're moving towards your goal. But staying the same weight is not any progress whatsoever. And I think, Eric, there's a nice little, appendix here that we can add just to the concept of maintaining weight during various periods of time can be actually beneficial. One, you getting accustomed to either being leaner or being heavier if you're entering a heavier weight class, and then also allowing your performance to catch up, where some people might notice because it's the fluctuation in their daily caloric intake. Who knows what happens? Well, they'll notice fluctuations in their performance. were you maintaining at a new weight, whatever the new weight for you, new relative weight, so plus 5 kilos, minus 5 kilos, plus 10 kilos, minus 10 kilos, can be progress in the long term. And I think that is a third option that a lot of people, because they just want to see the scale move, to feel like they're moving towards some goal. It feels like it's not a goal, even though it is, and it is absolutely progress.
No, absolutely. So I think there's two things at play here. One is that people really struggle with outcome versus process oriented goals, and they really struggle to see process oriented goals as success or moving towards, like you said, your goals. And that if it's not a change in an objective number, you haven't moved towards your goals. But there's a big difference between someone who is hanging out at the same body fat percentage, at the same weight, and the same measurements in muscle mass, who is barely just kind of managing their lifestyle to be there, and someone who has it down pat and then can layer new processes on top of that, which I think is exactly your case, the situation we're looking at. You dieted down to a body fat, leanest you ever been, and now you go, oh, I can maintain this. Actually, my body fat ranges are, this is a new conception for me. My lifestyle, this went from challenging to Monday, you know? So I think that is a huge, just gaping hole in the fitness industry in general, and especially in the bodybuilding industry, where we equate measurements, numbers, changes, and scale weight. But to throw them a bone, like, absolutely, if someone is like, my goal is to put on muscle mass, I have gained no weight in a year, at the same body fat percentage, you technically have not gained on your outcome. So, but then you have to ask yourself, well, would it have been beneficial during COVID with inconsistent gym access to even try to achieve that goal? Or is this a time to focus on something else and pick my spots? And I would argue, absolutely, it would be silly to try to, in an inopportune environment for someone who is near the top of their genetic potential to make a hard push. Like, why would I add 10 pounds of fat to my frame and not much else, Another thing to think of is that some people really struggle with others having different goals than them. So like by that same metric of you haven't gained any muscle mass or put on any body weight, you've made no progress. Most IPF lifters in their 30s or in their 20s who are getting stronger and moving up the ranks have not made any progress. You can absolutely get stronger at the same body weight. There are so many components to strength. Hypertrophy and muscle size is but one of them. There are morphological adaptations that are not increases in cross-sectional area that increase strength. There are technical changes. There are refinements to your skill. There are neuromuscular adaptations. So you absolutely can get substantially stronger while hanging out roughly at the same body composition and body weight. So I think that's worth pointing out, that you're getting stronger, you're improving habits, and you're picking your spot in terms of what is the best environment for you to try to make muscular gains. So I think that those things are all worth saying. And then finally, just to throw, a pass a little bit backwards in time to Chris Barakat, you absolutely can recomposition. So it does become more and more challenging the closer you get to your genetic ceiling to make something out of not a whole lot of external energy and just go down in body fat while you're going up in muscle mass, especially as you get low in body fat, where you run into all the issues we talked about earlier that we exemplified in contest prep bodybuilders. But it's not uncommon for, say, a advanced lifter, in the off season, who is close to their genetic potential, going from, say, 17% to 15% over the course of multiple months, and also gaining muscle mass. That's 100% possible. That's not strange. That's not that's not something that is like magic, and it just requires good training and a slight deficit or roughly around maintenance and making progress. So I think all of those factors need to be considered, that maintenance is a viable option. The cut bulk cycle does not have to be something you do, especially not if your goals are strength. And certainly if you are getting to a new body fat percentage that has previously been hard for you to maintain, but that isn't giving you necessarily physiological symptoms that this is too lean for you, changing your behavior, changing your lifestyle, and focusing on process-oriented goals. I take a walk in the morning. I eat a fruit and vegetable with every meal. I get in more lean protein. I change my training schedule to X, Y, and Z. I make sure to get in my, my creatine and my multivitamin, et cetera. I'm just getting better about all of my habits, and I find that it's getting easier and easier to hang out at this body fat. Sweet, I've extended the envelope of what my sustainable body fat is. Then that is worthy of saying you have made progress. You are moving towards your goals, and that's a useful tool, maintenance in that case. Eating at maintenance and focusing on just making a new set of habits that define your lifestyle, so that you can then, when the time is right, layer new habits on top of that, a slight calorie surplus, and make progress, and not be the person who just immediately slides into, a huge dirty bulk not because they think it's best, but because they were just too restricted. So I think those are all valid reasons to focus on maintenance for sure.
Cheesecake Factory now delivers 24/7. There are numerous issues here. I will say probably the final note, just one of hope for those that might feel like it's a daunting task ahead. I would say that, and I'm sure, Eric, you would concur, that individuals, if you stick long enough in this game, your skill sets level up. To your point, when I leaned down, even recently, to a leaner average point of me just existing at this lower body fat percentage, it took a little time to get adapted. And then after, instead of it being something I was consciously doing, it was just another Monday, it was another Tuesday. And this happens in so many different ways when it comes to lifting. So if you feel that you don't have all those skill sets yet, these things are developed in time. The more you dedicate yourself, the more you just focus, the more you're introspective, all these things. So I don't want to say anyone can achieve any goal that they set out to be, because, hey, look, if you want to look like Ronnie Coleman, we need to talk. Okay, we need to have that sit down, come to Jesus conversation. But you get better over time, and that's one thing just to keep in mind with your goals. And I'm confident with most people, most of their goals, they can achieve them. It is just a longer period of time than most people would probably expect.
Omar, I think that's a fantastic capstone to this conversation, a message of hope, but from a framing of realism. And I really do hope, dear listener, that you understand not only some of the scientific critiques of the P ratio model, but also the rationale behind when you should cut or bulk, and maybe when the answer is neither. So yeah, I just want to say big thanks to you, Omar. I think you contributed some really good points on the psychology and the framing on this one. And a big shout out to, we're eventually going to have to make peace with these guys, to Eric Trexler and Greg Knuckles for doing a great job on this topic.
Yeah, I think, Eric, shout out to you for crushing it as always. I think we probably have to pacify Stronger by Scientology and have some sort of agreement, because once again, we're waging an intergalactic war. And between the two of them, Stronger by Scientology, putting it to rest that, yes, in fact, Eric Trexler is, in fact, your clone, would be easy to do. Okay, we can appease them, no problem. I'm sure they would settle for a superficial apology, whereas those ancient aliens are kind of hell-bent on world domination. So I think if we want to give us the best opportunity to win, we should shake that hand.
We can't wage a war on two fronts.
Right.
And ultimately 2021 is the year after the year of division. So I think it should be a year of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Not conciliation. We don't never do that. Coming together, compromising, and we're going to, I'm going to go outside after this episode, and I'm going to look for an olive branch, and then I'll figure out how I can actually send that through the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say for those that they heard the intro and their interest was piqued, because we have listeners from all over, right, that are just tuning in every single week to Iron Culture. It's trending. It's what's happening. It's the in thing. To find out that in an upcoming episode, we're going to have our Delaware lawyer. We're going to sit down with aliens, and we're going to have a live we're going to settle this dispute. And it's not really a dispute of what happened or what has been happening. I think they just don't understand the legal framework of what we laid out. And they're in for a rude awakening. And when we have ascended not only this earthly plane, but into the intergalactic dimensions that they have conquered, and we take our rightful place as the oligarchs of our galaxy and beyond, it's going to feel pretty good.
Yeah. And we'll have Brandon cut this part out so it doesn't spoil the plan. But
sure.
that briefcase they're going to take back to the mothership that has the contracts in to sign, it'll actually be a nuclear weapon, and that's the real plan. But thank you for cutting this out, Brandon. If it's left in, well, you just doomed the entire planet. So
well, it's on you.
Hopefully you didn't. But so why don't you, after that part that's cut out.
Yep.
1, 2, 3. We'll get right back into it.
Yep.
Omar,
Good.
why don't you ride us into the sunset?
Yeah, thanks, man. So I just want to wrap this up by saying, Eric, this was an excellent episode. Look forward, as always, to the next one. Iron Culture listeners, if you want to leave a comment, go ahead and go on YouTube. We love to read them, occasionally respond to them. If you want to leave a rating and review on iTunes because you want to help out the algorithm, go ahead and leave that rating down below. We'll do our best to read those. I think we will start reading at least one of them per episode. So, do your best. A lot of them, Eric, are straight up funny. And we're back every single Monday. We'll catch you in the next episode.